me before, and together with my colleagues Peniel Rajkumar, Marietta Ruland, and hopefully in a moment also Simona Sin from the World Council of Churches, and our colleague Muturaj Swami from the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide, who also hopes to join us shortly. We welcome you to this first webinar in what we hope might become a regular series. Let me briefly explain the background for the benefit of those who are joining us for the first time. In December, WCC and CCCW co-hosted a two-day webinar on the theme Christians Studying Other Religions, Surveying the Field, Encouraging the Vocation. We had 20 to 25 Christian scholars of other religious traditions from many countries and various churches. And we explored the idea of developing a network to encourage and support Christian scholars and Christian students, Christian teachers in this field. And among many things, we discussed how we could network with each other, especially with our new experience of Zoom, how we can share resources and learn from one another, how we might, for example, arrange online conferences for students already in this field or students interested in entering this field. Much else, and all within a kind of overall concept of encouraging vocation in this field as resource for our churches, the value of this kind of work as a resource in many different ways for our churches. Mainly we were in plenary, but we also did break out into groups focused on Islam, on Judaism, and on Asian religions. And we recognize the value moving forward. There will be value in both working together across our different disciplines, across the religious traditions, including also, incidentally, indigenous religions, the importance of which was strongly encouraged by some of our members, and but also of meeting and working with scholars in our own specific fields, such as Islamic studies. There was consensus at the end that we should take forward the idea of developing this network. And one idea was to hold regular webinars to get to know each other and our work. So today is the first such event. We invited back for today all those who attended in December and also a few more. So we are especially welcoming those who are joining us for the first time, and Felix Kerner in Berlin has just joined us. Welcome. We just one or two things before we get started. We plan to keep these seminars short, knowing how very busy you all are, and on the basis of the philosophy that less is more, and I would rather you were left wanting more than wanting less. So we're going to try and keep it to an hour. If you all insist on more, we can always schedule longer meetings later. We hope to have papers that will be varied in focus on different traditions, but that will also be accessible and of general interest across our various disciplines. If there were more time, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, I would love to ask you all to introduce yourselves and say where you are and what is your chief area of work, because some of you are joining us for the first time. If there's a bit of time at the end, we may just very briefly do that, but we will, I think, leave that for now and turn to the program for today. Good. And so just on a practical note, I think you're already doing it. We're all very familiar now with the etiquette of these meetings to keep ourselves muted if we're not actually speaking. And just to let you all know that we are recording this event and we may be making it available to members of the network who are not able to join us today. So unless there are any other practicalities to mention, Peniel, I think we can proceed to introduce our speaker for today. Good. All right. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome as our speaker today, Dr. Phil Dorrell, Assistant Professor of Religion at Wofford College in South Carolina in the USA. It's only 7:30 in South Carolina, so Phil has made a very early start. I hope he's got a good mug of coffee there, and we're most grateful to you, Phil. And we are, of course, greeting you on the first full day of the new presidency. I'm aware of your own positive feelings about that, which I make no secret I share, but I'm sure all of us, whatever our views, would join in saying how much the US has been in our thoughts and prayers, and how much we pray for good things ahead, and greater unity and a more positive relationship with the wider world. So thank you for joining us at such a tumultuous time in the life of your nation. Very briefly, a brief introduction, because Phil is going to introduce himself, but Phil has studied at Indiana University and at Emory University, where he gained his PhD. His areas of expertise are Islamic studies and the history of Islam and Christianity in Turkey and the Middle East. And Phil is first going to give us a brief introduction to his work as a Christian scholar in Islamic studies, and then he will segue directly into a paper on Islamic theology in Turkey today. Thank you, Phil. Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm really happy to talk to everybody, and I hope it's all very interesting. So in the very beginning, I'll just tell you all a little bit about what got me into the field. Like I tell my students who ask me this question very frequently, and that is, I was around 16 years old when 9/11 took place. And I, up until that point, hadn't thought much about the outside world beyond my hometown in Indiana, in the United States, very much at all. And I began to think a lot about the world and about religion, about my place in it. And I was getting messages from American culture and everyone around me that were very Islamophobic, that I should be afraid of Islam, that I should be afraid of Muslims, that I should feel a certain way about this tradition and its practitioners. And then when I wound up going to college right nearby, at Purdue University and then later Indiana University, all in the same state, I got the chance to meet some Muslims from Turkey. And I had the experience of feeling like I had something in common with them that I did not have in common with other Christians. I think, and this is the basic sort of intuition that I've tried to work out in my academic work ever since, that there's something that I have culturally in terms of religious culture as an Eastern Orthodox Christian that I share with Muslims from Turkey and from the Eastern Mediterranean and that part of the world, because our religions come from, they come from the exact same part of the world. They come from the same culture, essentially. And so that experience of feeling a kinship with Muslims and with Islam that I didn't even feel with other Christians, like sort of reversed the Islamophobic sentiment that I had been exposed to and thinking about during those years. And then I just wanted to keep learning more, getting deeper into it, and sort of building a academic career on trying to sort of have my students, my future students now, my current students, have that same experience of dispelling some of the anxiety and fear around Islam and Muslims and prejudice around them, because I think it would be helpful for our country to dispel that prejudice. So that's basically what got me into it. As it relates to my faith identity, I've noticed that over the years, because I got into this field because of a sense of kinship with Muslims from that part of the world in particular, I've noticed that the more I delve into understanding the Turkish Islamic tradition, the Islamic tradition more broadly as well, from within its own perspective, as Muslims themselves understand and believe it, the more I actually feel devout in my own faith and practice as an Orthodox Christian. Like, what I've told people is that actually the longer I've gone on in Islamic studies, the more I've gone into Islamic studies, the more Orthodox I feel, to be honest. So it's actually, and that has been produced by the continual experience of essentially seeing something about my religious culture, seeing something about my tradition in the other continually, has produced a continually deeper appreciation and attachment to my own faith and my own tradition. So so it's actually Islamic studies that has helped me deepen my own commitment to Orthodoxy, because I see that kind of cultural kinship in those two faiths. So I enjoy learning about it. I enjoy teaching about it. And it, like I said, it plays a big role in strengthening my own sense of my own commitment to my own faith tradition. So moving from that to my presentation, so now I will talk to you a little bit about Islamic theology in contemporary Turkey. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, the host disabled participant screen sharing. 1 second. I need some more of this anyway. I am the host now. Sweet. Okay, so let's fire this thing up. Okay, can you all share, see my screen, it looks like? All right, cool. I'm sorry, is it still recording? I think I forgot to hit the record button myself. Is it still recording at the moment?
It is recording. I'm recording it on.
Thank you, I appreciate that. That was my fault, I just forgot to start it, but thank you for still doing it. Okay, so Islamic theology in Turkey today. So brief introduction. So what I'm basically just going to do are give you some of the major themes of this particular tradition, tell you why I think it constitutes its own tradition, and then move from there into why I think it's also think about why it's important for us to think and maybe talk about. I'm going to go ahead and hit my timer here to keep me on track. The cover image here, by the way, is an homage to one of the great theologians of the contemporary modern Turkish tradition, Bekir Topaloğlu, and the work that he wrote in the early 1970s. So I refer to this larger body of ideas, the Islamic theological tradition in modern Turkey, as modern Turkish theology. And what exactly am I talking about here? This is Islamic religious thought that is written in the modern Turkish language. And that'll be important in a second as to why I emphasize the linguistic particularity of this tradition. Late 19th century to the present, so 1880s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up until the present day. It's a tradition that is found in the university system of the Turkish Republic. These are universities that are the descendants of the late Ottoman academic tradition, particularly when it comes to Islamic thought and Islamic theology. So these are very academic, systematic projects, and that's the particular tradition that I focus on because that's the one that I think is neglected the most in the contemporary study of Islam in modern Turkey. Although we have with us Dr. Felix Kerner, one of the first people ever to talk about this in English, so thank you for being here. His book began our study of that, in fact, in English. So why study it at all? I think the reason why it's important to study this modern Turkish tradition of theology in the specific methodological sense is that it's a corrective to the predominantly secular or materialist or political, maybe you could say, approaches to Islam in the Western Academy, particularly when it comes to Turkey. What I mean by that is that Western scholars of Islam tend to be interested in Islam and Turkey as it relates to policy questions, so as it relates to foreign policy, politics, and this is all very important, and I don't have any critique of these fields per se, just that we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about Islam and Turkey as a tradition of religious thought, as a tradition of religious intellectual exploration, and as a tradition of theological reflection on themes that are important to the entirety of the human tradition, thinking about modernity. And I think for the reason I'll talk about here in a moment, I think the modern Turkish tradition has a lot of very, very insightful things to say about modernity in particular, from the perspective of religious thought and the perspective of belief and of faith. And before we get to the questions of politics and sociology, which are all very important, but I think receive separate coverage. So I sort of think of I sort of thought of three themes here for the presentation to kind of break apart the basics of this tradition. The first I call faith, fortifying belief and the experience of transcendence in the face of Turkish secularization. And what I mean by this is that modern Turkey was created in the 1920s and 1930s, the Turkish Republic, through a series of deeply radical reforms that completely upended traditional practice of Islam in the public sphere in that society. The government radically secularized every aspect of society that we could, a very aggressive secularization program that went so deep it, in many ways, criminalized or outlawed mainstream pious practice of Islam in Turkey in service of this radically positivist sort of governmental philosophy, statist philosophy. And so the first task of Islamic theology in Turkey, starting in the late 1800s, because this movement is a product of Ottoman materialism, of late Ottoman materialist sort of scientism. Starting in the late 1800s, Islamic theologians in Turkey, Muslim theologians in Turkey, the Ottoman tradition sort of saw this ideology as a threat to belief itself, and began to develop a modern theological tradition to respond to that attack on belief in the divine and experience of transcendence in the modern world. One of those, the second I call here foundation, the second of these themes, one of the key components of this radical secularization program was the language reform, which was the total abolishing of the actual language that was used by Muslims and Muslim scholars in the Turkish Islamic tradition, the Ottoman language, which is, as this is known to many of us, but this was a language written in Arabic script and combining features of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian all together. It was heavily modified. The Arabic script was abolished, and it was replaced with a modern nationalist language written in the Latin alphabet, which is what modern Turkish is. So in other words, the modern Turkish tradition really starts in a very clear way because it has a whole new language associated with it. There simply was no modern Turkish theology before that language came into existence, we could say. So this is why I think modern Turkish thought, modern Turkish Islamic thought has a lot to say to the world about modernity, because it is a native of modernity. Like the modern Turkish theology speaks the language of modernity natively, because it came into being through this radical new linguistic project. And that forcibly broke it apart from its past. So Muslim believers and scholars who just a few years prior had done all of their work and their reading in this language were now doing it in a whole new language that the state constructed and was imposing on their intellectual practice and faith tradition. At the same time, though, these developments, while they were very restrictive and very repressive in some way, also produced a whole new kind of politics that gave a whole new kind of creativity and freedom to religious thought in the modern Turkish context. The third theme I have here is freedom, where the setting of the republic and the development of democratic institutions starting from 1950 and throughout the 20th century led to all new ways of Islamic theology talking about democratization and the secular, social change, human rights. And so much of Turkish theology in the modern period concerns those questions because it had this new framework for thinking about Islam given to it by the Republic, by the Turkish Republic. And so the task has become fortifying faith and the belief in the one God, reconnecting and reconstructing the Islamic tradition in this brand new cultural, sociocultural, political environment, and sort of reconnecting itself back to that past, reconstructing the Turkish Islamic past in a brand new language, and exploring the boundary between, trying to figure out what the boundary is between the core essence of Islam, the core essence of what the Muslim faith is, and the parts of it that are considered to be changeable, the parts that are considered to be historically contingent and up for debate, social relations, gender relations, things like that. So all of these different themes come together to form this tradition, and I think all of the way that the modern Turkish tradition talks about these things has a lot to say to us about modernity in general. So just one quick slide on the sort of progenitor of this whole tradition, whose works unfortunately are not discussed very much in English, but hopefully someday he'll be translated. Ismail Hakkı İzmirli, who was a late Ottoman theologian and whose works really produced the foundation for the whole of the modern Turkish tradition. And so a little bit on his stuff will help sort of set the tone for my contemporary example here in just a moment. He was a classic example of someone who was a product of the actual Ottoman madrasa, the Ottoman traditional system of Muslim higher education, and then its reformed version. And then he wound up working in the Republic as well. So he's someone whose thought spans that entire transition period from the late Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic. He talks about theology as the peak of all human knowledge because it analyzes the whole of the human experience in the light of God. He's very concerned with, and then whatever I say about him, I think applies to everyone after him to a great extent. He's very concerned with the fact that modernity, and then as modernity progresses on in his experience, the secularist republic really fragments and destroys the holism and the unity of human experience and the richness of human experience in the Ottoman Muslim tradition. And so he talks about theology as this project to really reintegrate all of what's crucial about being human and being Muslim in a larger intellectual sort of foundation project that he calls the New Theology. And he has sort of a list of things at the very beginning of his systematics that he describes as sort of the components of what he thinks a new theology, with all the different topics that modern Turkish thought should explore, basically. Adherence to reason and evidence when talking about theology, so not discarding scientific reason, but actually using it as a component of a new theological vision. He analogizes this with the way that classical Muslim dogmaticians used Aristotelian logic and science in their works. He thinks that modern Muslim theologians should do the same when it comes to modern philosophy and science. Life and worship and service of the truth, so also orienting oneself as a believing Muslim towards worship and towards a life in service of the one truth and not being distracted by political ideologies and things like that. He talks about cultivating bonds of solidarity and connection between people and at a social level, so cultivating love and kindness between individuals, and then justice on a social level as something also missing in his view of modernity. And attaining a sort of holistic flourishing. Saadet means like felicity, but it's like a sort of ultimate fulfillment or happiness, both in this life and the next. So for him, theology really is this kind of this large project to re-sacralize all of human experience in the modern context, but also using the insights of modernity to create a Muslim faith for a new era, essentially, but based and rooted in its tradition. He calls this the New Theology, and he calls his method Iqani, which is a very archaic but a very helpful Ottoman term that means dogmatic or certain. And dogmatic in the sense of you can be absolutely sure that this knowledge is true, that it reflects the truth about the world. And so for him, theology's first task was to prove the existence of the one God, and that the theology in the Turkish Republic should be founded on the basic task of proving once and for all the certainty of the one God's existence, which he saw as being the belief in which he saw as being the most serious threat to religion in the secular Turkish Republic. So as modern Turkish theology develops over the next 100 years to the present day, it really just keeps drawing and pulling on things out of his work. So I'll talk about one contemporary trend that's going on right now with people working on it as we speak, that sort of epitomizes these larger dynamics. And this is what I call the Maturidi Renaissance. Maturidi, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, was one of the great Sunni Muslim, and I should clarify too, everyone I'm talking about here is from a Sunni tradition, which is the case for Muslim academia in Turkey, for the most part, in the large majority. Abu Mansur al-Maturidi was one of the great Sunni Muslim dogmatic theologians coming from what's called the Kalam tradition, the K-A-L-A-M, the Kalam tradition, which is just a technical term talking about the genre of theology that explores the basic questions of Muslim belief. And this tradition of theology develops throughout the early history of Islam, and it has a few major figures to it that create a certain way of talking about the basics of Muslim belief that become influential for all of Sunnism thereafter. So in my mind, at least, I think of someone like Maturidi as like a Cappadocian or an Augustine, like someone who creates a certain way of thinking about Muslim dogma that influences many, many people after them as a sort of distinct train of thought that has all kinds of members within it. The second great tradition here is the Ash'ari tradition. Why is he important? So as part of the revival of Turkish, the revival and renewal of Turkish linguistic and national consciousness during the Republic, one of the big tasks of modern Turkish culture is to create a national identity that really didn't exist in such a clear form before the Turkish nation, the Turkish national experience. What this did for Islamic theology in particular was that it basically gave license for Muslim theologians in Turkey to explore all different kinds of people they may not have seen as theirs before. Maturidi's thought was deeply influential in the Turkish Islamic tradition throughout the Ottoman period, to be sure. But in the Republican period, he becomes seen as somebody who is really truly central to a distinctively Turkish way of talking about Islam. And so he becomes understood as a central figure in Turkish national consciousness, in the sense of he is part of a tradition that leads directly to the modern Turkish understanding of Islam. So what this all means is that there has been a huge renaissance in the study of this dogmatic theologian Maturidi in the past 20, 30 years. It is very, very similar in style and format to, if we're all familiar with, the Orthodox Christian neo-patristic movement, to resuscitate, that's bad, we're not resuscitate, but to like renew is a better word, to renew and reintegrate consideration of like the Cappadocian theologians, the Orthodox patristic tradition, into contemporary reflection, the Catholic tradition of this as well. Forgive me, I can't speak French, so I'm not going to destroy pronunciation of this important term, but y'all know what I'm talking about. This tradition of reviving the fathers here, the great dogmatic theologians of the church. This is really the exact methodologically what's going on here with the Maturidi school in contemporary Turkey. Trying to think about all these contemporary questions I mentioned before through the theological insights of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. The best editions of his works in the original Arabic have been done by Turkish scholars. The professor whose work I showed at the beginning of the presentation, Bekir Topaloğlu, did the best editions of Maturidi's work that are now available to all of us in their original Arabic. So this is one component of this modern Turkish tradition, is this reconstruction, this renewal of these great classical theologians and putting them in service critically, but also constructively in service of contemporary questions. And Maturidi by large, I'm talking like hundreds of thousands of theses, articles, books. I mean, it's an enormous project in contemporary Turkey. It goes on forever. So I'll give two examples of two of the great living contemporary theologians who are part of this larger movement, and to sort of link them to these two themes I mentioned before, foundation and freedom. Hülya Alper, she is a professor at Marmara University in Istanbul. Also, by the way, these two universities, Marmara and Ankara, also represent kind of the peak of the theology faculty system. There's dozens and dozens of theology faculties at Turkish universities now, and these two are kind of at the top of that list. So this is a good representation of their importance as well. Hülya Alper, her work deals, and these two emphases I think are sort of epitomize the whole larger tradition of studying Maturidi in contemporary Turkey, and also emphasize two of the great themes in the whole of the modern Turkish tradition. That's why I'm talking about them. Hülya Alper talks about Maturidi as helpful because it helps to clarify the ground of our access to the truth. She uses Maturidi's work to try and more clearly understand how it is that human beings have access to the one truth. Again, the concern here being, how can we be sure in modernity as believers that we know the one God is real, that we know the tradition is real, the tradition of Islam here in this case, the Sunnah of the Prophet, the tradition of the faith of Islam. How do we know that ground is real? The ground of our surety there is the relationship between reason and revelation. And she uses a great phrase throughout her works, the priority of reason, but the necessity of revelation. And she talks about how in Islamic systematic thought, especially from Maturidi, reason has priority for human beings. Reason is what we use to understand the world and to approach everything around us, but reason has a kind of ontological necessity. And so her work focuses in all kinds of fascinating detail on how reason and revelation interact with one another, necessarily so to produce knowledge of the truth, to produce certainty of the truth. Theology is what happens when we properly understand the interaction of reason and revelation, leading us to the truth. The second theologian I have here, Sönmez Kutlu from Ankara University, represents, I think, this second tendency about freedom. And for him, Maturidi's work is useful in clarifying the ground of human flourishing. So again, going back to that theme of sa'adet and about human social advancement. So for him, reason and revelation are also crucial, because for Maturidi these are as well. But for him, he talks about reason and revelation as working together to secure humane existence and liberty. Freedom and liberty play a huge role in the way that Kutlu talks about Islam and religion in modern Turkey. And his work focuses on how we can cultivate those values in the modern context, precisely through cultivating their importance in the classical sources like Maturidi. He talks about how reason is used in theology to distinguish between the unchangeable and the changeable. So he mentions his work deals very, very explicitly with the idea, trying to understand what is it that constitutes the core unchangeable essence of Islam, and what constitutes the part that is free to change: social relations, gender relations, parts of the tradition that are historically contingent and may no longer apply in the modern setting. He used this to think through a lot of questions of fiqh, of Muslim social practice. So for him, he talked about theology as meaning sort of actively living out God's will through both fidelity to the unchanging truth, but also with the same emphasis on freedom and social change that he sees in this dynamic coming through Maturidi as well. So, so these two tendencies are that they're tendencies, they're emphases. These are not people that, at least not in my experience, talking with them, working with them in different academic ways over the years. These are not people that, in my experience with them, have any kind of like rivalry, or these are not things that are seen as like two different schools or two different competing tendencies or competing ideas. These are just these are both tendencies in the same school of thought. These are tendencies that both, I think, scholars would recognize as complementary to one another, but have different sort of emphases and different sort of priorities in different settings. And finally, I'll plug my own book because, you know, why not? So if you want to read more about this, I have a book coming out in April that discusses all of these things in broad outlines, where I start from the late 19th century up till the present day, talking about many more, a few dozen, I think, different theologians that across this tradition. And so I just had to put that in there. I appreciate your indulgence, and I'm happy to I appreciate your attention. Happy to take any questions or comments. So thank you very much.
On behalf of everybody else, I'm giving you a round of applause there, Phil. Thank you. That was
thank you.
That was great. Really concise, clear, and very, very interesting. I mean, I only dabbled a little bit in Turkish Islam, helped by you, by my friend Felix Körner's groundbreaking work in this field, and the overlaps, but also the distinctiveness of this particular tradition within Islam is a fascinating topic. While we were speaking, just to say, we were joined by some other guests. That we have Angeliki from Thessaloniki. Angeliki Ziaka, welcome, and Chae-Yong Kim from Korea, welcome to you. And our colleague from the World Council of Churches, Simona Sin, joined us, and also Muturaj Swami in Cambridge in England. Welcome to everyone. So we have plenty of time for discussion. Thank you for being so concise as well. Now, to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, I think there are multiple ways of doing that. You can either raise a physical hand, which I might see more quickly, or you can indicate with a hand, a technological hand through Zoom. Peniel, if you see one of those and I'm not noticing it, please tell me. So I can see Catel and Felix. Good. Well, let's go in that order. Catel, would you like to kick us off with a question, and then Felix after?
Yeah, thank you very much, Phil. That's great. I'm fascinated. I have a question concerning Sufism. What is the place of Sufism in Turkish Muslim theology?
That's a great question. So yeah, I should I of course downplay the limited scope of everything I do with my life, but so I should point out that this tradition of Turkish Islamic theology encompasses all the different aspects of Islamic religious learning, from Sufism to ritual practice to philosophy to all these things. The stuff that I focus on happens to do with the dogmatic theology. So there are versions of this modern tradition that apply to all those different aspects. There is a book by, I'll put it in the chat so we can all see it. Let me make sure I get sent to everyone here. There's a book that deals exactly with that question by Mark Soylo. Okay. Mark Soylo, I believe is how his last name is spelled, that deals with, that does exactly this, that looks at Sufism as the way that it's talked about in the modern Turkish language sources. So it's treated in much the same way, that it's part of the understanding of Sufism is reconstructed in this way as with respect to what parts of it constitute Turkish national tradition, and therefore what parts of it receive special emphasis in the academic setting, And that's sort of the beginning stage of it in the nationalist period. And then as time goes on, it broadens out to what does Turkish tradition have to learn from the whole of the Muslim Sufi tradition. So there's as many people working on all the different aspects of Sufism as there are on the academic study of the dogmatic theologians. In a practical sense, Sufism has been a part of Turkish Muslim everyday practice for, I mean, centuries, and that has not gone down during the Republic. It was much of it was persecuted directly by the early secularist state as being seen as kind of backward or antithetical to the secularist project. So Sufi practice was singled out for special persecution by the early secularist state. And in the 80s, 90s until today, it's been revived very heavily. So as many of you, I'm sure you know, Jalaluddin Rumi's tomb is in Konya, is in the middle of the Turkish Republic in Anatolian Peninsula. And it receives, I mean, God knows how many visitors and pilgrims every year. Rumi himself is seen as being a key part of Turkish tradition, as being a part of the distinctively Turkish brand of Islamic practice. So yeah, Sufism is seen as kind of an integral whole to all of it, as part of the integral whole to all of this, and it receives the same consideration as what part of it constitutes distinctively Turkish version, what part of it is universal. Rumi is seen as kind of a universal part of it who has roots in what's now contemporary Turkey, but also people like Yunus Emre. I'll put his name in the chat as well. You can find stuff by him, some really good translations in English. There's a translation of Yunus Emre, oh my gosh, by Hallman. Talat Said Hallman's translation is very good. So in other words, a lot of Sufi folk poets from Anatolia have been revived and received academic study and editions in this period. And they are now being used more in a practical and theological sense, like Yunus Emre in particular.
Great. Felix.
Yeah, first of all, Dr. Dorrell, congratulations.
Thanks.
Very interesting, super inspiring, and also very clearly presented. Oh, you hear me, yeah?
I do.
Yeah, okay. Good. Yeah. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
One short remark on Catel's question, which is already something like a question. When I speak to Turkish Muslim theologians and present a thought by Augustine or sometimes even by Thomas Aquinas, they often react, if they are dogmatic theologians or exegetes of the Quran, almost allergically saying, well, that's Sufism, as if you can either be a scholarly, systematic, logical theologian or somebody taking in inspiration from mystical traditions. I think that is actually a bit of a difference between the tradition and, well, one of my short questions will be, is that the same experience you have, that a hardcore theologian, so to speak, doesn't want to know much about Sufism and their thought and inspiration. Second point, my experience with Turkish theologians at the moment is that the freedom they used to have in the university is strongly restricted in under the second Erdogan, as I would call him. So one statement from a friend was, we have become a society of fear. And that is also felt among the way theologians express themselves. I heard publicly speaking theologians criticizing the move on Hagia Sophia and so on, but still I have the impression that they are not daring to be as interesting as they used to be, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, Dr. Karen, thanks for being on the call, first of all. Yeah, like I said, your first book was enormously important, so I appreciate you writing it, and thank you for your feedback very much. Yeah, it's your second point first. Yeah, your second point first. Absolutely. I mean, there's no question. Yeah, since the 2011-2013 period that many other scholars have talked about you know the new period of authoritarian rule in Turkey. Yeah, it's a whole different place. I mean, I don't without going to details, because I would actually be afraid it would impact someone's job somewhere. My experience has been the same. Yeah, it's a very different climate. People are just as complicated politically as they always were, but they're just not talking about it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's just absolutely correct. The first point, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's sort of, I think for me it's dependent on the person. Like I've met theologians who consider themselves to be, if they consider themselves to be like sort of really connected to the Ottoman tradition, to thinking deeply about Ottoman, like not reviving, but like reconnecting themselves with the Ottoman tradition of Islam in Turkey. They tend to talk very holistically about like Sufi spirituality plus theology plus philosophy plus whatever. But if you talk to somebody who's like an academic specialist and all they do is research, you know, the Mu'tazila or Maturidi or whatever, yeah, they're very focused on their discipline. I think so. For me, that's kind of dependent on the person that I'm talking to in the academic setting. I think in the broader point, the broader phenomenon is that in all of the theology faculties, those are treated as separate disciplines. So like there's a section of mysticism, a section of hadith, a section of fiqh, a section of philosophy, a section of dogmatic theology. And so I think what you're talking about sort of points to the fact that in the academic theological setting, you have to pick one of those to do your PhD in. You have to pick one of those to do your thesis in and your research in. And so all your colleagues work on just those texts. So I think a lot of people probably, I think if you're a devout Muslim practitioner, I'm sure, I think you draw on all those things in your own personal practice. But yeah, in your academic life, yeah, I think it's very common to have somebody who's focused on just one of those things, because that really is how the whole system is kind of set up. And I think the earliest examples of that happening were actually the late Ottoman Darul Funun Reformed University back in the late early 1900s. Started to do that. They started to create a European-style university departmental structure, and then they just slotted all of the traditional Muslim fields of learning into departments. So like your hadith and your mysticism became a department, and that's sort of developed along with those boundaries. Yeah.
Okay, I see two hands going up. Could I, Ursula and Martin, before I bring that, could I just ask you, while we just have this theme of second Erdogan and so on, I mean, I'm sure that's an issue of broad general interest because of the phenomenon of a change of political climate and the impact of that on freedom of religious thought and so on. Could you just very briefly give us some examples of some of the ways in which theologians are, you know, are finding themselves restricted, their wings are being clipped in terms of what they can or cannot say? I mean, just could you give a little bit of an example of where that?
So from the beginning of the Republic, and really the Ottoman period as well, the state has maintained the right to treat all religious practice as potentially threatening to it. In other words, the Turkish state has for a long time thought of religion as something that is a potential rival to its authority. And so it asserts jurisdiction over it frequently. And this is true of whether it's a secularist style like the Kemalists in the early 20s, 30s, and 40s, or whether it's the contemporary conservative religious version with Erdogan. And then there's periods where the state sort of wants it to flourish and be diverse and have all different kinds of activity, and then parts where it clamps down and sees it as threatening. And so an example of this would be, it's technically, for instance, illegal to threaten or undermine or insult the state or its leaders in different ways. And technically that's not allowed, legally speaking. And so that can have legal consequences if your work is somehow seen as undermining the state in some way. I think the most concrete consequences for theologians today have been you lose your job, you lose your academic position, okay. You become kind of blacklisted from that world. So I think the most common threats to theologians in a concrete sense are loss of career and loss of livelihood and loss of connection to that community. And so people, aren't quite as open about their politics as maybe they used to be. At the same time, though, the theologians in this tradition, in this academic tradition, whether it's the Ottomans up until today, have also always seen themselves as not adhering to any particular politics. I mean, they've always talked in very like, we are academic practitioners of this discipline that talks about things that go beyond any local politics. And so they've never actually been that, they've never actually talked that much about politics to begin with, to be honest, like, and by design. So like, I could not even guess who people vote for instance. Like, I don't know, it's just not something that people talk about. So in a sense, you have less freedom. And in a sense, this tradition has also never really tried to talk in a partisan way. But yeah, but the consequences are definitely, you worry about your job if you run afoul of the ruling party.
Great, that's very helpful. Let's hear some more questions. So we had Ursula and Martin, and Ursula, would you like to go first? And then Peter,
Yes.
I see. Okay.
Thank you. Is there feminist Muslim theology in Turkish? Does it have a place in the academia or more outside the academia? Is it connected? I'd like to learn a little bit more about that.
Yes, that's a great question. Let me put another name in the chat. There is academic Turkish feminist theology. The big name in this is someone named Hidayet Şefkatli Tuksal, who, again, forgive the self-promotion, but I have a whole section about her in my book. She wrote a book called Projections of Misogynistic Discourse in the Islamic Tradition, which is a systematic analysis of the Hadith tradition and the Quran to sort of break apart and understand the egalitarian core of the tradition and distinguish it from historically contingent misogynistic discourse. And she uses the word misogynistic in its Turkish version. So there's a very actually strong tradition of what we would call feminist theological reflection in modern Turkish. Her work is the biggest of that. It did have an academic place. She was a professor at Mardin, the University in Mardin, for a while, and she's a very well-known voice in Turkish public academic discourse and commentary. She was also a major activist for the headscarf movement, for freedom to wear the headscarf in the 90s, and she's active in all kinds of social justice causes, gender justice causes. So that tradition is very, very strong and has been in Turkey for many decades now. But like everything in the past about 10 years is now strongly determined by the way the state feels about it. And so it's not quite as vocal as it used to be, unless it's receiving explicit state support. And one interesting thing about the current ruling party that it's also helpful to note is that the first 10 years of the AKP's rule, like it's, as Dr. Kerner said, helpfully the second Erdogan, the second, we could say, or second AKP, you could say second Erdogan. The first 10 years of the AKP actually presided over intentionally an absolutely radical transformation in gender balance in Turkish Islamic academia, to the extent that in the first 10 years of the AKP, they consciously cultivated women's religious expertise and academic knowledge to the point that on the order of 50% of all of the preachers, people who's not the ones who lead prayer, but people who are officially appointed by the government or licensed by the government to preach about the faith, to preach teachings about the faith in a local mosque, 50% of those people are women now, thanks to the first 10 years of the AKP's gender justice program. I would even venture to say that if I remember the most recent statistics, the majority of graduate students in theology programs in Turkey right now are women. I mean, so there is a huge presence of concern for gender justice in Turkish Islamic academia that actually comes from the AKP, and it's the first 10 years the seeds were planted in the first 10 years of its version, and are really coming to fruition. So that's also taking place, even though independent theological speculation is less, as we've been saying, a little bit more restricted now than it was a while ago. Thank you.
Could we move to Martin's question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Phil. First, only a brief remark and probably a suggestion. I found it very interesting, your personal explanation in the beginning, that you felt as an Oriental Orthodox Christian much more closer to to Turkish Muslims than to other Christians. And this
in
is,
some ways, yeah.
In some way. But anyway, I mean, that you said it, I mean, that was very, very interesting for me, because I'm since many years concerned with the relationship between intercultural communication and interreligious communication. That means the question is, in your case, that you feel a certain form of common ground, or cultural common ground, probably. And I only would like to name this issue and suggest in the future that we would take up this topic. No? Because on the other hand, I mean, in Germany, for example, we have the problem of the conflicts between Christianity and Islam because of the different culture also. No? But anyway, I mean, the problem of intercultural communication and interreligious communication dialogue is, I think, a very important topic. But anyway.
You've just muted yourself, Martin. Martin, you've muted yourself.
Okay, my question, what I said before about intercultural and interreligious communication was heard. Yeah?
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate that very
well,
much.
My brief question is, if you could outline briefly some positions or main positions concerning among those new theologians about the relationship between state and religion.
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for your first comment too. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I stress only too that sometimes, I mean, sometimes Orthodox Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, I think sometimes stress too heavily their difference from other Christians. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to be very sectarian with respect to Western Christianity. That's my only, point there. I don't want to come off too sectarian. But yeah, there's definitely a very cultural affinity that I feel, that I appreciate that encouragement that I want to keep thinking about and working on. With respect to state religion, yes, that is precisely the question that people can't talk about, that they used to talk about a lot. So you used to have all different kinds of articles and things speculated, people talking about what should we do about the new options for state and religion. And that's something that people just really don't talk about right now, because that could directly implicate them in consequences to their jobs. Because if you talk about state religion right now, you got to take a position on the current ruling party. And that's just not a wise thing to do if you don't agree with everything that they're doing. In general, I would say the broad outlines. One of the things that I think is distinguishing about the contemporary and the modern Turkish tradition is that there has never been there's never been a strong part of modern Turkish Islam that was anti-democracy. Like there's never been there's never been this sense that democracy itself, or even secular democracy, is inherently inimical to Islamic tradition at all. Like that has been taken as sort of a given, as a good in and of itself. So one of the distinguishing features of Turkish Islamic discourse from the Republic until today, when it comes to state religion, is that there's just no debate over whether or not our society should be democratic, or over whether or not it should be in some sense secular. What the secular means is a huge topic of debate, but that it should be in some way secular, and that it should in some way and that it should definitely be democratic in a republic, that's just taken for granted. And that, I think, is a very important thing to understand about the modern Turkish tradition, is that all of that stuff is taken for granted. And all of those arguments in favor of those things from a Muslim perspective were made back in the 1890s, 1900s, 10s, 20s, and 30s, and were just accepted and are now uncontroversial. So that's sort of the baseline. So then the questions begin then to revolve, like no one talks about the caliphate. I mean, that's not a thing that people talk about in modern Turkish. Or like a state based on some kind of modernist conception of totalizing Sharia, also just not a thing that people talk about. Whether you're conservative or not, it's not a thing people talk about. So that's the baseline. The questions that develop from that therefore become, okay, what does democracy look like? Is it something we would call a majoritarian democracy? Is it something that we call a pluralist, multicultural, multinational democracy? I mean, those are the kinds of real debates that all intellectuals in Turkey have over, does our conception of Turkish nation encompass all different kinds of people? Does it encompass, should it be focused specifically on Turkishness? Those are the kinds of questions that really concern all thinkers in modern Turkey, Muslim theologians included.
Great, thank you. Phil, I'm conscious, do you have a class to get to or something?
I have a preschool to get to, so I will leave at 8:30, but I got 3 minutes, so.
Okay, you got to, well, do we have time for a quick question from Peter?
By all means.
Peter. Peter, you unmute, please. Peter, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, excuse me. My question, dear Phil, is concerning their exploring boundary between the changeable and the unchangeable in a religion.
Mm-hmm.
As theologian, we have no problem with that, but when you do that in a university academic setting, there is always the question, yeah, but what is unchangeable? Is there unchangeable truth? No? And in the academic world, I once had the experience in Japan, talking with many scientists there, and I was almost laughed at it, because we believe as Christians, we believe that there is a truth, that is a religious truth, and that is unchangeable. So is there an experience in your field on that level?
Yeah, it's a very important question, as you point out. It has to do a lot with, it comes from the fact that modern Turkish Islam was born in this experience of radical social change, and had to very quickly sort of determine what it considered to be falling into which category. I also talk about this in my book, so you can read there as well. But there's basically, it boils down to, it roots itself, the basic answers to this root themselves in an older Islamic tradition that points to cardinal beliefs about God and the tradition. So the basic creedal aspects of Islam, the creed, you could say, of Sunni Islam, and then the basics of ritual worship as being unchangeable. So it's never going to be the case that Muslims are not required to pray, no matter what happens in society. It's never going to be the case that Muslims stop believing in the prophecy of Muhammad or the oneness of God. That's not going to happen. So ritual worship in its specifics often, but certainly in its required aspect, and then belief in God and the tradition, those things stay. But all social relations, what it means to be a human being in relation to others on the basis of politics, gender relations, that stuff is just really extensively debated in its details, as considered part of the area of human experience that some people think that these aspects have parts that are unchangeable, and some think that they're very fluid and in flux. But that's kind of the conventional boundary, I would say, is there's agreement that the creed and the importance of and specifics of the worship are the unchangeable, and then social relationships, politics, are the part that is variable and is up for all kinds of debate and contention.
Phil, thank you. It sounds as if you have family responsibilities to get to now. Is that correct?
Thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity very much.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you. It's been great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we'll